Hi everyone, today we're going to address a new topic from personalization to public infrastructure. Who holds the model? We've become very used to personalization. Our feeds anticipate what we'll scroll. Online stores show us products that feel accurate. It is convenient, it is tailored, and sometimes it even feels like the system understands us. But personalization isn't understanding, it is modeling. And behind every recommendation, there is a statistical process. Any clicks, pauses, purchases, searches, they are translated into patterns. And those patterns are compared against millions of others. And from that, the system predicts what you're likely to do next. So you're not necessarily being understood as a person, but more so being grouped as a probability. And most of the time that feels harmless. If a playlist misses a mark, we skip a song. And if an ad is wrong, we ignore it. At worst, it's annoying, but the stakes are low. However, underneath that logic, the modeling, the clustering, the prediction, it doesn't only stay inside music apps or shopping platforms, it does scale. And the same probabilistic logic is used in fraud detection. So that would mean banks monitor whether a transaction fits your normal behavior, and it sometimes, if it does deviate, the system flags it. As well, security systems do the same thing. When you log into an account, the system asks whether that's typical, whether the device is expected, and whether the location is consistent. So if your behavior falls outside your predicted patterns, the friction does appear, and what follows is verification steps, multi-factor authentication, and temporary locks. So meanwhile, personalization does mainly state, we know you. Security says you need to prove it. And both of them rely on the same foundation, that is behavioral modeling. So here's when it becomes more than convenience. We use the same modeling logic that powers large-scale infrastructure systems, including the public ones. For example, in healthcare, data platforms aggregate enormous amounts of information. And these systems can help coordinate care. They can identify inefficiencies. They can highlight as well patterns in population health. And when used well, they can improve outcomes. But they also rely on the same underlying logic: collect, cluster, predict, score. So when personalization logic becomes infrastructure logic, the stakes do change. For example, if a music app misclassifies you, you get a bad recommendation. But if a healthcare system misclassifies patterns, it can influence how resources are distributed, which areas are prioritized, how risks are calculated, and where attention is directed. So this doesn't mean that something is secretly wrong, and it doesn't mean that there's a conspiracy or anything. It just means that the scale of power is different. So public healthcare systems in the UK are modernizing, and data platforms are being introduced. Vendors, some domestic, some international, are involved as well in building and maintaining these systems. And people are asking questions such as who governs the data, who has access to it, how are the models audited, what oversight exists, Can the system be exited or replaced in the future? And what transparency is offered to the public? So these aren't irrational fears. There are governance questions because healthcare data is not the same as shopping data. It does include mental health histories, genetic information, chronic conditions, deeply personal experiences. So when personalization logic touches that level of intimacy, then the ethical threshold rises. There's also something subtle happening too. As when systems profile us for personalization, we sometimes rarely notice. When system profile us for security, we immediately feel the friction. But when system profile populations for infrastructure decisions, the process becomes abstract, sometimes invisible. We don't necessarily see the models, we don't see the weights, we don't see the assumptions built into the code. So this doesn't automatically make it harmful, but it does make transparency essential because modeling is never neutral. Models do reflect the data they're trained on, the incentives of the organizations using them, the definitions of risk chosen by designers, the priorities set by leadership. So in a private app, those incentives might be, for example, engagement or profit, but in public healthcare, the incentives should be well-being, fairness, and long-term sustainability. So that's why people care, not because data is being used, but the power is being, because power is being structured. So it's reasonable to modernize systems. It's reasonable to use analytics to improve coordination, and to integrate digital platforms into public services. But the ethical question isn't whether technology should exist in healthcare. It is about how it's governed. So that would then inquire who owns the data, who audits the algorithms, who ensures vendor accountability, what legal and structural safeguards are in place, how transparent is the system to the public it serves, and probably most importantly, where does human judgment remain amidst all of the automation? So statistical modeling can inform decisions, but it shouldn't silently replace them. So when personalization shapes what we see, we do adapt. When security systems judge our behavior, we do comply. But when infrastructure systems guide public health decisions, we deserve visibility and clarity and governance that matches the scale of influence. So maybe the real questions aren't, is this good or bad or anything else, but rather what standards should scale with power. If the same modeling logic that curates our playlists is now part of coordinating national healthcare data, then the oversight should scale accordingly. Transparency should scale accordingly. Accountability. Concern doesn't equal conspiracy. It can simplify. It can simply mean that we understand the data systems that shape reality. And when those systems move from convenience to infrastructure, from private platforms to public services, the conversation becomes ethical. Because in the end, personalization feels personal, but infrastructure is collective. And when collective systems are built on predictive models, we owe it to ourselves to ask, how are they designed? Who do they serve? And how they're held accountable? Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. So hope that that was interesting. Hope that today you learned something new. And thank you for taking the time to listen. Take care.